He was suffocating at the hospital door, but they threw him out with the words, "This is not a shelter." The doctor humiliated him in front of the waiting crowd, and passers-by turned away. The old man walked away silently, clutching his chest, where his combat stripe was still visible under his torn coat. No one saw a hero, everyone saw only a tramp. A shadow. And no one stopped to ask who he really was. Unjust, or just? If it feels wrong to you, write down your opinion in the comments. Frank Dawson woke with the same ache in his spine that had become his alarm clock. No need for a bell, just the dull grind of age, of jumps and landings that shattered bones decades ago and were never properly mended. He sat up slowly, the springs in the old cot groaning louder than he did. His one-bedroom apartment smelled faintly of old paper and black coffee, the kind you make too strong just to feel something. The morning was gray, the kind that looked like it had given up trying to be anything else. He shuffled to the window and opened the blinds halfway. A stray sunbeam hit the medals on the shelf. He didn't look at them. Not today. Not yet. There wasn't much food in the fridge, a cracked egg carton, some dry toast, and half a jar of mustard. But he made do. He always did. After all, Frank had eaten worse in places where the sound of helicopters replaced birdsong, and the dust was red with something no rain could wash off. He pulled on his coat, the same one he'd worn for 12 winters. A patch near the shoulder bore the faded outline of an airborne division. Nobody noticed it. People saw ragged men with tired eyes and figured the rest. Just another old guy whose life had passed him by. On his walk to the corner store, he passed the construction site where the new tech building was going up. One of the workers, a kid no older than 20, struggled with the engine of his battered Civic, parked near the curb. Frank stopped. "Battery?" he asked. The kid looked up, surprised. "I think so. Or alternator. Won't turn over." Frank nodded, stepped closer. He glanced under the hood, jiggled the wires, tapped the side of the battery with the back of his pocket knife, just once. "Try it now." The car sputtered, then roared. "Whoa," the kid shouted. "How the hell did you?" "Old trick," Frank said. "Get the cables changed. Don't trust the first spark to last." The boy offered him a 20, but Frank waved it off. "You need that for lunch," he said, then turned to go. He didn't walk fast, his left knee wouldn't allow it, but he walked tall. Until he passed a group of teenagers sitting outside the coffee shop. One of them laughed too loudly. Another mimicked Frank's limp as he passed. He heard it. He didn't stop. The clerk at the store barely looked up when Frank entered. He picked up a can of beans, a loaf of bread, and a bag of rice. He counted his change twice at the counter. "Short 50 cents, the clerk muttered. Frank patted his pockets, then hesitated. "I can put back the rice." Someone behind him in line exhaled sharply. Frank turned slightly and said, "Sorry." But no one responded. He paid, took the bag, and left quietly. On his way home, he passed a woman on the sidewalk trying to calm a little girl crying hysterically. The mother looked flustered. "She got separated at the park," she said. "She's scared of the sirens." Frank knelt slowly in front of the child, his joints protesting the movement. "You hear that sound?" he asked, pointing toward a distant ambulance. "It means someone's getting help. It's not scary. It's brave." The girl blinked, calmed a little. Her tiny hand reached toward his jacket. "Are you a soldier?" she asked, touching the faded patch. Frank smiled gently. "Used to be." She gave him a shy salute. He saluted back, the motion instinctive, still sharp despite the arthritis. When he finally made it home, Frank placed the groceries on the counter. He lit the single bulb above the sink and looked down at his cracked hands. He had no visitors. No family nearby. No medals on display, no uniforms on mannequins. But every day, in small ways, he found something left to give. He never asked for thanks, only the chance to still matter. The following morning, Frank awoke with a tightness in his chest. It wasn't pain exactly, more like a weight pressing inward, steady and dull. He blamed the weather, the years, the sleep he never quite got enough of. But by the time he reached the corner of 7th and Main, his breath was shallow, his shirt damp with sweat. The world tilted slightly. He stopped, rested a hand on the lamppost, and steadied himself. Then it happened. His knees buckled. He collapsed, hitting the concrete with the dull thud of an old tree losing a branch. No one screamed. A few people looked over. A woman with earbuds stepped around him. A man paused, then kept walking. Frank gritted his teeth and pushed himself upright. His palms were scraped. His ribs ached. But he stood. The hospital was just 3 blocks away. Each step was a negotiation, between pride and exhaustion, between grit and gravity. When he finally pushed open the glass door to the ER, the fluorescent light made him blink. At the reception desk, a young woman barely out of college looked up, chewing her lip. Yes. Frank stepped forward, trembling. Think I need someone to look at my chest. Hard to breathe. She gave him a once-over. Took in the coat, the worn shoes, the unshaven face. And with it came the flicker of judgment. Sir, she said stiffly, this isn't a shelter. Frank blinked. I didn't say it was. We're very busy this morning. Do you have an appointment? I collapsed outside. My heart. She cut him off. Sir, if you're experiencing a real emergency, you can take a seat and wait. But if you're just looking for a place to stay warm. Her tone dropped to something rehearsed, cold, polite, and lethal. That's when a young doctor walked by, white coat freshly pressed, coffee in hand. The receptionist motioned him over. Dr. Sanderson. Could you? The doctor glanced at Frank. What's going on? Another transient, she said under her breath. Frank heard it. I'm not, he began, but the doctor was already shaking his head. Sir, this is a medical facility, not a charity. If you're not in cardiac arrest, I need you to leave. Frank didn't move. His lips parted, searching for the right words. There weren't any. He could have shouted. Could have told them where he'd served, how many surgeries he'd endured, how many nights he'd bled for a country that now treated him like a stain. But he didn't. He simply looked down. I see, he said. And he turned. There was no applause. No outcry. No gasps of horror. Just the faint squeak of his shoes on the tile as he walked out, and the heavy silence that filled the space he left behind. Outside, the wind had picked up. It caught the edge of his coat, flaring it out behind him like a tattered cape. He crossed the street slowly. Sat on a bench just outside the pharmacy. Let the cold settle in his bones. Down the street, a boy rode past on a skateboard and stared at him. Frank stared back. The boy looked away first. Inside the pharmacy, Frank bought a bottle of aspirin and a pack of bandages. At the checkout, the cashier didn't speak. Just rang it up and pushed the items toward him. As he stepped out into the wind again, Frank caught his reflection in the dark glass of the window. He didn't see a hero. He saw an old man people avoided. A nuisance. A ghost. He walked home slower that evening. The limp sharper now, his pride somewhere back on that hospital floor. That night, he left his coat on. The apartment felt colder than usual. He didn't eat. Didn't turn on the TV. Just sat on the edge of the bed and stared at his palms, still red from the fall. If he had shouted back, they might have understood. But he only lowered his head. The next morning, the world was silent. Frank woke before dawn, his breath misting in the cold air of his apartment. The radiator had gone out sometime during the night, but he didn't bother checking it. He'd learned to live with the chill. Cold was familiar. Predictable. Like pain. He shuffled into the kitchen and poured water into the kettle. The hiss of gas, the click of the burner, the flame. Small sounds. Steady sounds. The world still turned. While the water heated, he walked to the corner of the room, to the cabinet he rarely opened. The metal latch creaked. Inside was a box the color of dried blood. Dust clung to it like moss on a stone. He carried it to the table, sat down, and opened the lid. The first thing he pulled out was a black and white photo, a younger man with sharp eyes and a crooked grin, arms slung around his squad. Frank was in the center. They stood in front of a Chinook, all dirt and sweat, with their dog tags swinging in the desert wind. Most of them were gone now. Below the photo was a folded flag, corners still crisp. He placed it gently to the side. Then came the medals, bronze, silver, the kind they pinned to your chest when the newspapers didn't know what to call what you did. Purple Heart. Distinguished Service Cross. 2 others without ceremony, mailed to him years later in a padded envelope. He laid them out like a shrine. Then the letters, dozens of them. Some typed, others handwritten in looping cursive. Letters from the families of soldiers he'd dragged from burning vehicles. From the parents of a medic he'd carried through gunfire. From a widow who said, "You gave me 1 more year with him. That year gave me a son." Frank held that letter longest. The kettle shrieked. He didn't move. His hands were trembling now, not from the cold, but from the weight of memory. The room seemed smaller, darker, heavy with ghosts. He saw the faces. Kenny, who cracked jokes right before breaching doors. Vasquez, who sang Sinatra after every mission. Hallie, who never made it home. Frank had held him in the sand and whispered, "You're not alone," until the light left his eyes. He wiped at his face and didn't pretend it was anything but tears. Outside, the city woke up. Cars moved. Doors slammed. Life continued. But inside this apartment, the past had returned like a tide. He finally stood and made his tea. Sat again. Turned the medals in his hands, one by one. The weight of them, so real. So small. None of them paid the rent. He looked over at the drawer where he kept his discharge papers. Somewhere in the fine print was a line about honorable service. It didn't mention the VA delays. The missed checks. The times he sat on hold for 2 hours only to be disconnected. It didn't mention the shoulder that never healed right, or the limp that cost him a job at the post office. It didn't mention the silence. That was the hardest part, the silence. Not the kind in foxholes, not the stillness before a firefight. This was different. This was the silence of being forgotten. Of walking into rooms where no one knew your name, or worse, didn't care. Frank finished his tea. Let the last drops warm his throat. Then he gently placed the medals back in the box, one by one. Folded the flag again. Replaced the letters. Closed the lid. He returned the box to the cabinet and shut it. Outside, the wind blew harder now. A leaf scratched against the window pane. The radiator hissed once, then stopped. Frank sat in the stillness and folded his hands. The battles he fought never made headlines. But they shaped nations. The next morning began like any other. Frank opened his door to fetch the newspaper, only to find a car parked directly across the street, matte black, engine idling, windows tinted. He narrowed his eyes. Not the type of car you saw often in this part of town. A man stepped out. Clean shave, pressed uniform. An army colonel. Frank blinked. 2 more soldiers emerged from the vehicle. One wore white gloves and carried a briefcase. Another walked toward Frank's building with the calm precision of a man who had spent a lifetime in formation. They stopped in front of his stoop. "Sergeant Major Frank Dawson," the colonel asked. Frank didn't answer. Just stared. The colonel straightened. "I'm Colonel Mitchell, U.S. Army. May we have a moment of your time, sir?" Sir. That word hadn't been used on him in years, and never like that. Behind them, another car arrived. This one marked with a logo from a local news station. A cameraman stepped out, adjusting his lens. Then another van pulled up. Then a second news truck. Word was spreading, though Frank still didn't know how. The colonel stepped forward, pulling something from the briefcase. "This is a formal letter of recognition, issued by the Department of Defense, in regard to your service record and recent incident at St. Joseph's Hospital." Frank flinched slightly. "You, what?" The colonel's voice softened. "We were sent here to correct a mistake. And to honor a man who should never have been forgotten." Behind them, more people had begun to gather, neighbors, store clerks, a few passers-by who recognized the insignia on the uniforms and stayed to watch. A woman whispered, "What's happening?" A man replied, "I think he's someone important." A security guard from the hospital walked up the sidewalk. He looked nervous. Behind him, a familiar face appeared, the young doctor from 2 days before. Dr. Sanderson. He looked pale, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The colonel turned and addressed the growing crowd. Sergeant Major Frank Dawson served 32 years in the United States Army. He completed 4 tours overseas. He received 2 Silver Stars, a Bronze Star, and multiple commendations for valor. He personally led the evacuation of injured civilians during the siege of Dakin province. 42 lives were saved in a single night because of this man. There was a collective stillness, as if the air itself had frozen. Frank said nothing. His hands were folded in front of him. His shoulders, which once sagged from years of dismissal, now rose slightly, not with arrogance, but with the quiet gravity of someone who finally saw the truth being spoken. Someone gasped softly in the crowd. That's him. That's the guy they turned away. Dr. Sanderson stepped forward. I didn't know. I made an assumption. He faltered. Frank looked at him, eyes steady. You saw what you wanted to see, Frank said quietly. You're not the first. The doctor bowed his head. The colonel gestured to the soldier beside him, who opened a polished case and revealed a newly struck medal. Gold and red, with a ribbon of deep navy blue. This is a formal reissue of the Distinguished Service Cross, lost due to administrative error 23 years ago. The Pentagon expresses its deep regret. Frank hesitated before taking it. He didn't weep. He didn't smile. He simply nodded, once. From the crowd, someone began to clap. Then another. And another. It wasn't loud. It wasn't wild. It was slow. Measured. Respectful. A salute rose from one of the younger soldiers, and then from the others. Even the news crew lowered their cameras. The colonel stepped back and said the words Frank never thought he'd hear again. Do you know who walks among you? And for the first time in decades, Frank Dawson stood taller than the silence. The city hadn't seen a military ceremony in years, especially not on the cracked pavement outside a rundown hospital. But by noon, traffic had slowed to a crawl. Police cordoned off the block. News crews jockeyed for position. A canopy was hastily erected. Folding chairs appeared. More soldiers arrived, a half-dozen from a nearby base, dressed in full ceremonial uniform. A trumpet player tuned his instrument near the ambulance bay. Frank Dawson stood among it all, still wearing his old coat. A fresh ribbon had been pinned above his heart. The edges of his collar were worn, the seams frayed, but there was something about his posture now, something unbreakable. Under the canopy stood hospital staff. The receptionist from 2 days ago was nowhere in sight, but Dr. Sanderson was there, this time with his white coat removed, hands behind his back, face solemn. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward once more and raised the microphone. His voice, carried over a temporary PA system, cut through the wind. Today, we acknowledge a failure. A failure of perception. A failure of gratitude. And a failure of memory. He turned toward Frank. But more than that, we honor a man who served without asking, gave without needing recognition, and endured what few could. Frank said nothing. A soldier stepped forward with a folded flag and presented it to him. Another saluted and placed a bronze plaque on a small pedestal beside the hospital door. It read, "In honor of Sergeant Major Frank Dawson. For service beyond duty. For dignity in silence. For courage never forgotten." Frank's fingers traced the engraved letters. He blinked once, then turned to face the crowd. Reporters pushed forward, cameras whirring. Microphones were raised, but Frank ignored them. He looked at the children gathered near the curb, some seated on their fathers' shoulders, others holding tiny flags. He cleared his throat. The crowd quieted instantly. "I don't have much to say," he began. His voice was rough, low, but clear. "I didn't ask for this. I never served for praise or plaques. I served because I believed in something bigger than myself." He paused. Looked at the rows of faces. Some ashamed. Some awestruck. Some with tears in their eyes. "I've been many things. A soldier. A brother. A husband. A man who came home when others didn't. And I've made peace with a lot of silence. But this moment, I didn't expect it. Dr. Sanderson stepped forward suddenly, visibly shaken. He removed a velvet box from his pocket. This was found in a storage unit at the VA. It was misfiled years ago. I wanted to return it personally. He opened the box. Inside was Frank's original silver star, the one he'd reported lost during a move in the late 90s. Untouched, gleaming. Frank stared at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, he extended his hand and took it. The doctor lowered his head, not just in apology, but in reverence. And then, in front of everyone, he dropped to one knee. The crowd inhaled as one. Not from obligation. Not from ceremony. But from something deeper, shame, awe, and the weight of understanding. One by one, others followed. A nurse. A father. A teenager who had once mocked Frank's limp. Down the line, knees touched pavement. And Frank. He didn't flinch. He didn't gloat. He stood quietly, looking at the sea of bowed heads, hands clasped in front of him. When he finally spoke again, his words cut through the hush like wind through flags. "We all fight unseen battles," he said. "Every one of us. So I hold no anger in my heart." There was silence. Then, at the edge of the gathering, a boy stepped forward. 6 years old at most. He walked up to Frank, saluted with both hands, and whispered, "My dad says you're a real hero." Frank looked down, knelt slowly, and returned the salute, just as crisp as ever. "So are you," he said gently. A tear slid down the boy's cheek. So many eyes turned glassy. And in that moment, it was no longer about medals or headlines. It was about something older, quieter, and more enduring than any monument. Dignity. Grace. And the forgiveness only true strength allows. The ceremony faded with the setting sun. By evening, the crowds had dispersed. The soldiers departed in their convoy. Reporters packed up their tripods. The plaque remained by the hospital doors, a bronze sentinel of memory, glowing softly in the amber streetlight. Frank walked home in silence. No escort. No cameras. Just the shuffle of his worn boots on the pavement, and the quiet rhythm of his cane tapping the sidewalk. In his arms, he carried a small wooden case, the one the colonel had handed him. It held the restored medals, the flag, the letter from the Secretary of Defense, and a neatly folded newspaper. His own face stared back from the front page, below the headline. "The hero we never saw." When he reached his building, a small boy sat on the stoop with a drawing in his lap. Crayons scattered beside him. The boy looked up and grinned. "I drew you." He held up a crayon sketch, a figure in a long coat, a medal on his chest, a salute at his side. Frank smiled. "Looks just like me. Will you put it on your wall?" "I'll frame it," Frank said. The boy beamed and ran off into the night. Inside, the apartment hadn't changed. The radiator still wheezed. The ceiling still cracked in the same corner. But tonight, it felt different. Warmer somehow. Lighter. He placed the wooden case gently on the table, then set the boy's drawing beside it. The metal box went back in the cabinet, next to the letters and the faded photographs. This time, though, he left the cabinet door slightly ajar. Let the world see, even if just a little. From the window, he watched headlights roll past. A city too big to remember most things, but maybe, just maybe, it would remember this. Frank sat on the edge of his bed and untied his boots. The movements were slow, ritualistic. His hands were steadier than usual. He looked toward the coat on the wall. The patch on the shoulder. The seams that had held through every winter. He folded it carefully and set it across the back of his chair. Then he stepped out onto his porch. The night air was cool, but not cruel. The sky overhead shimmered with quiet stars. Somewhere down the street, a trumpet played faintly from a radio, a war-era melody drifting through open windows. A car drove by and slowed. A teenage boy in the passenger seat raised 2 fingers in a casual salute. Frank returned it. Across the street, a young girl waved at him from a window. He waved back. The world had not changed. But his place in it had. No parade. No statue. No parade ground thunder. Just sunlight earlier that day. A bowed head. A child's drawing. Some heroes never ask to be remembered. But now, they always will be.